All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. I am your host, Dr. D. We are back with a lesson from rural Ontario. If you've ever been outside the big urban center and you know what that feels like, episode is for you, talking about emergency management, corporations, and how do we win in the chaos. So sit back, grab yourself your favorite beverage. Let's get at her. All right. Thanks again for joining us here at the podcast. Listen, I want a big shout out and a thank you to everybody sending well wishes as the recovery continues. If you're not aware, I just had a bit of a pause in life while we dealt with something. And we're well on the mend now, and we're headed back to somewhat normal operations. At the same time, it seems to coincide when chaos happens, it seems to all happen at once. You know how Murphy's Law, if it happens in threes and all of those rules. You know, when something happens, I decide to take a knee, scheduled with the medical folks. I need to take about a month or two off to deal with something. And then the corporation needs to go under a set of changes. And then a couple of incredible opportunities. One in the last couple of days landed in my lap. And I'm sitting here going, this is hilarious. The one time when I needed the downtime to deal with life, the universe, and everything, it's when chaos starts to reign. But guess what? I've decided that the field of preparedness is where I want to live. It is chaos. It is reigned by uncertainty and the effects of a whole bunch of decisions that are beyond my control. So guess what? I need to get used to that. But this week, what I want to talk about is as we rebuild some of our deliverables, which, by the way, if you're looking at the calendar, it is the 6th of May, which is our launch date. But pay attention for the 28th of April. The 28th of April is the 5-year anniversary of the first podcast episode released. So I'm putting together a bit of a fun little montage and a fun little set of ideas and events that are going to happen on that episode on the 5th anniversary that will come out on the 28th of April. But as we go forward, the 6th of May is when we are relaunching a bunch of things that we have at the parent company, Preparedness Labs Incorporated. Right now, the Inside My Canoe Head website is going to go down very shortly if it's not already dark. I'm switching over to another service. But as I joked last week, I'm not an IT guy. They want me to fill out something called a CNAME and a bunch of other crap that I just don't understand. And you send emails and they're like, just go over here. We've got directions on our corporate website and the FAQs. I'm like, yeah, but I read them and I have no idea what language you're speaking to me in. Well, just follow the steps. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't know what your steps entail. Go to this, the DNS, DS. I have no idea what any of that is, but fair enough. One of these days, I'm just going to take the leap and get on one of those call platforms and sit and wait for Mark from IT Services to jump on the call and help me figure out what it is. And it's probably a 10-second cut and paste. But anyhow, that's life going on. We're going through machinations. This morning, I just published a Substack article and then subsequently back up on LinkedIn as well, talking about the lessons I learned from rural Ontario. And now I had the opportunity to go to a conference at the Northwest Response Forum in Dryden, Ontario as an invited guest. And I went up there, obviously, to give a presentation. But really, my intent behind accepting that was I've learned to be humble, number one. But number two is I've learned there is much I don't understand. And often what happens in the emergency management field, especially here in Canada, and I'm sure it's true elsewhere, is you get caught up in the urban sprawl. And what I mean about that is you get caught up in the idea of how urban emergency management is run. What we don't, or what we fail to consider, or we intentionally ignore, you can look at that any way you want, is that in rural portions of our country and many other countries that are listening to this, emergency management is not done in the same way. It's, some of the colloquial phrases may say it's done off the corner of somebody's desk, it's done off the back of a cigarette pack. The point being is there is exceptionally less resources available, but substantially more regulatory environments. And what I mean by that is much of the same rules, at least here in the province of Ontario in Canada, are similar across our 444 municipalities. So, under the government regulatory framework based on the Emergency Management Civil Protection Act, soon to be updated again in later 2025, last updated in 2022, sets out the requirements and the standards through that and Regulation 38004, tells the municipalities, the 444 of them, what they must set up, what they may be capable of doing, and how they must report. Now, there is a bunch of administrative rules that are buried below the regulatory framework that are maintained offline by the ministry in contact with all of the different municipalities. But in general, it's the same thing, whether you're Clara Head in somewhere that has 9 total public service employees, or you're the city of Ottawa with 1.4 million people or 1.1 million people. The point being is that they don't differentiate the tasks given to municipalities based upon the structure of the municipality. So if you live in rural Ontario, and I went to visit the city of Dryden, which is 8,000 people, or the small communities of Rainy River or Red Lake, you face the same regulatory requirements that the city of Toronto does. It's ridiculous, and obviously people are doing it not to the standard that everybody would hope for, but they're doing it the best they possibly can. So the governance structure and the framework and the requirements set down and the reporting is all based upon, and I'm going to phrase this carefully because at the conference was quite a number of emergency management professionals, people working in the field, a lot of people from the Ministry of Natural Resources and a lot of people from Emergency Management Ontario. And I get the benefit of being an outsider, which means I don't represent anybody they deal with. I don't represent an entity that they have to be careful when speaking to. And so when I get up on a stage and I give a presentation that calls BS, and I attempt to tell them that a lot of what's going on makes no logical sense, they pull me aside afterwards and they're like, yeah, listen, if the province of Ontario was intending on delivering effective and efficient emergency management services to the served population, they would not use the current legislation, the EMCPA. They would not use the current governance structure or the current organizational structure of Emergency Management Ontario, how it's broken down by region, regional officers, a provincial emergency operations center, and the governance overhead that sits in the ministry in the city of Toronto and all of the policy frameworks. You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't, if you were to design a system that was designed with the intent to provide effective and efficient services to the people of Ontario to ameliorate suffering, you wouldn't use the current system in place. And this is from the people inside the system, both the people with the cool crested polos and the civilians that work as analysts, consultants, and everything in the arena. They understand that they have to work within the framework they have. So none of what I say is against the humans that are working in the system, but it's the way the system is designed. It's designed for low-cost services and to maintain command and control. It is not designed to provide best possible practices and best possible services. Now, the phrase best practices, I've said before, I don't like to use very often, because when I say I'm going to talk about best practices, that's assuming there are practices that are not, right? So what I like to do is phrase it as, I try to bring together what other similar organizations and jurisdictions have done and they have found success with, and then I put that at the feet of the discipline. If the discipline decides to pick it up and utilize some information contained therein, then I've done my responsibility. I've executed my task as a researcher, professor, and pracademic, for lack of a better term, in my corporate and entrepreneurial ventures. So the point here is that we have a structure that in Ontario, and what I'm going to say today about the structure and the not-for-profit and corporations, etc., you can probably, it's very generalizable in a research sense, which means you can take this information and plant it onto your jurisdiction that you have. When you think about as a resident, so if we put our personal hats on, right, you and me running around doing our thing, we think emergency management is generally police, fire, and EMS. It's, from a theoretical perspective, there's a differentiation in the field between incident response and incident management. Now, incident response is your police, fire, and EMS, which are all in general locally paid for. You may have a provincial police force here in Canada or state police patrolling your town, but it's paid for under contract by the municipality. So police, fire, and EMS is a contracted local thing, right? So your local government, using your taxation money from fees, but mostly property tax, provides this set of services. That's not emergency management. Emergency management is incident management. It is the next layer up. And so if you think about how emergency management operates, if we think that we have a major incident and on the ground there is what we call an incident commander. Now, because of the way the world works in first responders, it is 95% of the time going to be the fire chief that is on duty. He is going to assume the position of incident commander. The police, because they have a regulatory constabulary responsibility, they do something differently. And because the EMS, emergency medical services, are working on a different thing, different framework, they don't have that area of expertise. So basically, the incident commander is the human being on the ground who is managing the site of where the incident is occurring. So that person sometimes will ask for and get something called unified command. Now, under unified command, that means that the police, the fire, the EMS, the city public works, and any other government organizations that are in the area responding are put together in the same command post. And basically, it allows the incident commander to have better command and control over what is going on the ground. Emergency management is the function that supports that incident commander. So you've often heard of an emergency operations center, and you'll hear sometimes, especially in the United States of America, less so in Canada, but in the US, they're very open about we've activated the EOC. EOC is at level 1 or level 2 response. Fantastic. Love these people. But if we think about the EOC, it's a separate place where people very highly trained in the field of emergency management are there to support the incident commander. So emergency management's function is to reach out into the broader spectrum of government, and ideally, but we'll talk about this later, they do a horrible job of it, reaching out into all the sectors of society to draw the resources necessary to support the incident commander who's running the command and control of the at the coal face incident. Emergency management does that through a sense of creating a space where they command, they control, they run logistics, planning, very similar to a military command post where people are working the current situation. So they're dealing with demands that are constantly coming back from the incident commander back to the EOC to say, I need these things, I need these things, I need these things. And people are scurrying around, getting the resources and dispatching them out to the incident commander. But another element of emergency management is thinking next 24, next 48. What is happening? Bigger picture, what are we going to try to accomplish in the next 24 hours? What resources do we need? What authorities from government do we need? What additional institutions need to be brought to bear to support that incident commander over the next 24 or 48 hours? So it's the thinking, tactical, operational brain of the organization that's supporting the incident commander on the ground. And that is usually staffed in places like the city of Ottawa. We have an emergency operations center in City Hall, and we have full-time staff in the Office of Emergency Management. You go to the city of Toronto, and they have an emergency operations center. The gold standard in Canada is Calgary Emergency Management Agency. For a city of 1.4 million people, they have about a little over 130 full-time employees sitting in the function of emergency management alone. Again, this is not first response. It's not police, fire, and EMS. It is people tasked with the supporting of the incident commander and looking bigger. It's the connection to politicians. It's the connection to other levels of government. It's the public-facing voice. It's the public affairs. It's the public information. It's the public alerting. It's the public acknowledgement. It's the engagement. It's all of the things that facilitate the best possible support to the incident commander. Now, the city of Calgary invested in that largely as a result of the unfortunate experiences of the Bow River flood over a decade ago, and how, unfortunately, that did not go the way they wanted it to. And the city made a conscious determination of investing a significant amount of money into an emergency management function. Now, I personally have had the privilege of twice meeting and once interviewing the current chief, Sue Henry, just a fantastic human being. She has forgotten more about the function of emergency management on the ground and the tactical operational perspective than I'll ever know. And it's an absolute privilege every time I get a chance to talk to her. But the cities make investment, and that's great until you go to wonderful northwestern Ontario, where the city of Thunder Bay has a population of 104,000 and represents 55% of the total population of the region. So if you're looking at a region that might tweak up somewhere around 220,000 human beings, which is a fraction of the size of Calgary, and yet they have very few, if any, full-time equivalent people wearing the government, wearing any level of government patch. Now, there's your regional liaison officer from Emergency Management Ontario. You have the presence of natural resources, the Ministry of Natural Resources in the area for their wildland firefighting capability, identification and hazards folks. So there is a smattering of provincial employees, but when we look at the local coalface of emergency management, there is no one who is working on a full-time basis in this task anywhere, including the city of Thunder Bay. They don't have a full-time emergency manager who has an office of emergency management. If you were to use the ratio that Calgary does, you would have probably 8 full-time employees in the city of Thunder Bay working in a separate and distinct and funded office of emergency management, and they don't. And this is just a choice. I'm not berating the municipal directors of the city of Thunder Bay or areas of northwestern Ontario. It's that they've made the conscious decision not to create these positions. So a separate and distinct set of challenges that exist for northwestern Ontario when they don't have this built-up EOC, when they don't have full-time staff members. So when a significant event occurs in a region like that, and you can put this on most rural regions, is you don't have a very well-coordinated response effort. Now, the human beings there create great relationships. They have wonderful social capital. And despite the regulatory framework that they are forced to run emergency management under, they create incredible post-event outcomes for their citizens. And they do that by creating their own system. And this is something that they do a bit of... Well, they don't break the rules, but they've kind of jury-rigged the rules, shall we say. And they, several presentations gave examples of where, each municipality is required to have an EOC, right? Well, there's nobody to staff the EOC because none of the municipalities have full-time emergency managers. And when you give somebody an ICS 100 or 200 course, that doesn't make them capable of working in an EOC. You don't have trained teams. You don't have a common set of knowledge. You don't have people who are intimately aware of all of the hazards, critical infrastructure, the location of everything in the area. I spoke at length about the value of intelligence preparation of the disaster space. That was lost on a lot of people simply because they don't have the resources present. And so what I've offered is these individuals do something pretty incredible by jury-rigging a system behind the scenes, slightly outside but within the barriers of the regulatory framework, and they execute something brilliant. I've offered to them, and I asked this simple question. I don't know why you just don't get together and create a system that works despite the rules of the provincial government, right? Why not establish a regional emergency management agency and have that represent all of the cities and towns in your region? You create one EOC. You fund 5 people from across the 220,000 person property tax and corporate tax bill that come into the local region. You create one EOC, and every time an EOC needs to be activated, because remember, an EOC only needs to be activated for significant events, not every time something happens, that it will always be the same EOC in one location. And those of you that have worked in the field of emergency management, and if you can think about it, a well-staffed and well-run EOC can be 7 time zones away and still be as effective. They don't need to be, and arguably shouldn't be, co-located with the incident commander. They need to be a radio call or an internet call or a phone call away or an email away. There has to be connectivity, but that connectivity could be in a different country, and I could still run a brilliant EOC in support of an operation. So there's lots of ways of thinking outside of the regulatory framework box that exists. One of the big issues they have, though, is resource constraint. And when I mean resource, I don't just mean financial capital. And I try to look at resources in the sense of thinking it through the lens of capitals. Now, we know social capital is the sense of belonging, the value embedded in human relationships. Now, whether you're a social capital theorist that believes that is the relationships themselves, the resources and economic benefit within those relationships, or some combination thereof, social capital is the glue and lubricant that allows the flow of other capitals. So when we think about available capitals in a region, we think about financial capital. So the amount of readily accessible liquid assets that exist that could be brought to bear for a situation. When we think about human capital, we think about the skills, training, and knowledge embedded in the various different human beings that are located within the geographical region. When we think about physical capital, now sometimes people call this built capital, natural capital, whatever. I generalize it in built capital. Physical items that can be leveraged as useful tools in times of an emergency and what are physically available in a region. And what often happens, especially in rural emergency management, because of a time limiting and available human constraint, is that nobody does a total level asset framework. Now, some of my great friends over at Emergency Management Logistics Canada, a brilliant organization that brings together companies, that brings together corporations, municipalities, and not-for-profits under one online platform to talk about exchanging ideas and exchanging information and building relationships to support each other in operation, in response and recovery operations. They talk about asset-based community development. And part of this is based upon the idea that the first thing we need to know is what is there. And what often in rural places and even in urban, and I know the city of Ottawa doesn't do this, and I know the city of Toronto doesn't do it either, is, and the city of London to some degree in Ontario does it, but really nobody knows what assets are present in their community. They pretty good idea what the people have from a training, from a human capital and a physical. Most humans, homes are not really about the physical capital. There, we're thinking about the human capital. They can take a statistical database and figure out what the general human capital is available in the area. What they don't know is the physical capital, right? They don't know the physical capital and some of the human capital that are embedded in corporations. Not-for-profit organizations have long had a place at the table in emergency management, but for-profit corporations have been ideologically and intentionally excluded from preparedness, response, and recovery operations in Canada and many places around the world for an exceptionally long period of time. Now, the not-for-profit space is all about that ideological barrier for allowing the profit motive to enter into emergency management. So the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, Team Rubicon, and a number of other not-for-profits work in the emergency management space to provide emergency social services or other things in times of disaster victims. Now, I've never met a poor not-for-profit in the industry. Not-for-profits make profit, right? This idea that they somehow don't is just a money switching way, sleight of hand. They make profits. What they're not allowed to do is redistribute those profits to shareholders because they don't have shareholders. So what they do is they're allowed to reinvest in supplies and equipment and inventory related to what the function they do. They're allowed to have a limited set of cash reserves for the purposes of conducting response operations. And then they pay healthy salaries. If you look at some of the not-for-profits, not the smaller ones, but you look at some of the top-level not-for-profits, their salaries are well past the sunshine list here in Ontario, right? You know, several $100,000 for running a not-for-profit in Ontario is a bit ridiculous, but it's how a not-for-profit distributes its profits through higher-level salaries. So they make money. They're fine. The smaller ones, not so much. The bigger ones are okay. And it's the same with corporations. The smaller corporations are fighting tooth and nail to stay alive, and so are the not-for-profits. And the bigger corporations and the bigger not-for-profits are quite healthy. They make great margins, and they do very well for themselves. Now, when you think about the resource identification within your region, or what I'm using for this example, Northwestern Ontario, it is a heavily resource industry. So there's mine, gas, and lumber, and there's a huge transportation set of links on the water, on the rail, etc. And all of these corporations have significant human capital and training skills and knowledge, and they have an exponentially larger amount of physical capital and response equipment than all of the municipalities do combined, as well as the entire government of the province of Ontario is exceeded many times over by just what is present in the mining industry in Northwestern Ontario. And yet they're excluded from the table. They're not part of the discussions in response operations. And in other words, and I'll give you an example of one conversation that I personally had with a member of Enbridge who was at the conference. And this individual and we just had a quick conversation. He came up to me and he said, okay, I listened to your speech about the exclusion of the business environment and how business is ready, willing, able to go. They just don't know what table to go sit at. Who do they talk to? And he said, we just had a conversation as a member of Enbridge with a couple of the local communities and a member of the Emergency Management Ontario staff that were there. And they realized that some of the key equipment that they were looking for, he had. And it's sitting in Northwestern Ontario as part of Enbridge's duty and responsibility to protect its own assets. It has pre-positioned response capability. What he didn't understand, and because this is foreign to a lot of companies because they've never been invited to the table, is how does he get to the table? Like, how does he begin as a corporation, a for-profit corporation, with great assets that could be exponentially beneficial to the local emergency manager? How does he get to that table? And I said to him, it starts with the conversation. It always starts with social capital. It's about sitting down and beginning a conversation with the public you might potentially serve about the interests. He's already had that. He's talked to the mayors. He realized we've got a common interest. The company wants to help and they have the equipment, and the public governance wants that help and needs access to that equipment. And I said at that point, it's just a legal discussion. And this is where you just need to put the legal minds together to not tell you no, but in clear direction to tell you the how. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an indemnification expert. I know indemnification is provided by governments to not-for-profit organizations who conduct response operations in communities on behalf of the government. So I know it can be done for-profit companies. It's just I'm not that legal expert, but I know it can be done. So you put the people together. The advice that I gave him is there's nothing more powerful than the human relationships you can make with the communities you might serve or the communities in which you are present. Building that is exponentially beneficial for you just as an ongoing concern. It's part of your social license to operate. It's part of your ability because, companies hire people. They employ the people in the town. The kids of the employees and the kids of the owners play in the same hockey leagues and baseball leagues and soccer leagues. They go to the same churches. They shop at the same stores. They're just as important members of the community as the not-for-profit and as the government employees. The point here is that there isn't an established relationship, and it needs to begin. So the advice that I gave him is, you're not a lawyer and I'm not a lawyer, but get the lawyers talking, but build that relationship and have it going. And so the big key of this is, you don't know what you have, so you ask other people for it. And the way the system is set up in Northwestern Ontario, which is why I find it hilariously sad, is that the government of Ontario, despite what other provinces are doing, let's just say in a more efficient fashion, have one provincial emergency operations center. So all 444 municipalities have the right and are demanded to put all of their requirements through the EOC. Now, they can go through their regional officer, sure, but it's all going to end up at the EOC. The EOC is in Toronto, downtown Toronto. So somebody from Northwestern Ontario, several thousand, 1,000 or more kilometers away, is going to be demanding a duty officer something about something to deal with something, and they're totally disconnected. They have such a lack of understanding as to what the mission and what is going on in Northwestern Ontario. And the problem is that if the asset is identified, then the PIOC in Toronto has to go try to find it. And then, by the way, we're a pretty darn big province, the largest one in Canada. You can drive from my house west for 21 hours and still be in the province of Ontario. So now we got to move that piece of equipment from wherever the PIOC in Toronto might have found it to the municipality in need in Northwestern Ontario. Let's be clear. That piece of equipment they're looking for is already present in the corporate industry in Northwestern Ontario, but because the municipality doesn't know that, they have no choice to go to the PIOC. And because the PIOC is utterly unaware of what industry possesses in Northwest Ontario, they're going to go get it from somewhere else with this very close hold, tiny list of preferred suppliers they have, and they're going to allocate it. And they're going to offer it, and they're going to send it at an exponentially slower pace and higher cost than necessary to support the response operation. When it was already done, and basically what EML Canada and asset-based community development talks about is understanding everything that's in your community. So an emergency manager gets and this is the heart of disaster preparation or intelligence preparation of the disaster space, is that the knowledge is gained as to what human capital, what financial capital, and what physical capital is present in the served community. Who has it? Who has access to. Now we can build the social relationships with everybody so that we can understand, how might I get access to this piece of equipment or this trained set of volunteers or this trained set of employees in times of an emergency to ameliorate a situation. And all of that, to use Patrick Van Horn's word, is done left of bang, right? Everything should be done left of bang. If you're trying to find a resource, or if you're identifying resource requirements after an event has occurred, you've failed. Going into a community that has been hit by a disaster, that has been hit by a tornado, and then trying to figure out what the community needs are, doing a community needs assessment after the tornado hit, is pointless. Because if you work in the function of emergency management, and you cannot tell me what the specific needs are of a community hit by a tornado, I suggest you find alternate employment. And I'll be blunt about that, because it's very simple to understand. You look at the 147 communities that have been smashed by tornadoes in the U.S. in the last 20 years, and you look at the requirements of what they needed. You put that together. You don't need to ask what people need in generalist terms. You simply deliver it. Now, If you were in charge of emergency management for the city, you would have that information. You would know that you're going to need something, and all of it is simply about the numbers game. That, again, leads to what assets are in your area. And I'll give a couple of prime examples before we wrap this up. In the mining industry, they have their own private firefighting company. So when a fire breaks out at the mine, they don't call 911 and get the local volunteer force to come out. They have a private firefighting company that they've hired who's on site with fully trained NFPA qualified firefighters who will douse the flames. The same as EMS. When they need EMS, they have their own EMS, which is a private company hired that has fully trained paramedics and advanced care paramedics, and in some cases nurse practitioners, and in larger facilities maybe even a medical doctor on staff to deal with emergencies. They will take care of it. Now, if they need to get access to the provincial system for air ambulance, etc., they will. But when it comes to stabilizing and transporting a patient, the private industry will do it on its own. All of these assets exist at all of these mine sites. They have a massive amount of brush clearing. If you've looked at a timber company, you want to know about having a whole bunch of equipment designed to work in rural Ontario for cutting. You want to be able to cut a fire break. Why are you going to Public Works? All of that equipment sits in the mining and the forest industry right around you with trained, skilled laborers ready to help out. You just have to sit around the table, set the table, invite the corporate companies to the table to sit down and say, if we were to have to do this, what would this look like for you? What would it look like for me? And how do we set ourselves, our region, and our larger community up for success? So when we have a wildfire that hits Northwest Ontario this year, every year they hit them, and we need to build a fire break, we don't need to involve the Provincial Emergency Operations Centre in Toronto. We don't need to involve Emergency Management Ontario. What we do is we execute the relationships that we've already built left of bang with the corporate industry that has all these resources. They bring those resources to bear, and we protect our communities and ameliorate the suffering, all as a whole of community project. What I learned, my friends, in Northwestern Ontario is that resilience is a choice. It is a state of mind. They are a brilliant group of people executing things far beyond the resources that they have. They're doing so under a regulatory framework that makes no sense and is of little benefit to them, designed by policy analysts in a ministry in Toronto that likely have no knowledge of what's going on in Northwestern Ontario, but are excellent at writing legislation and regulatory environments. I have read EMCPA top to bottom. I have read Regulation 38004 and the other supporting regulations. I have looked at the inbound and previously amended set of regulations. I look at the new nomenclature and the new structure and program they have, and the Ontario Core that they've tried to launch. All of it is great, but it is clearly designed by a policy analyst in Southern Ontario. And I think that needs to tell you all that we need to know about supporting our brothers and sisters in Northwest Ontario. It was an absolute privilege to be there. It was an honor to speak. And thank you very much for your education. I was very ignorant in a lot of areas. I had some ideas that I thought were applicable, and I very quickly learned why they weren't in Northwestern Ontario. And by sitting down, shutting up, and listening, I learned a great deal about this incredible part of the country and an incredible group of people who are doing some amazing things despite the best efforts of the government. So thank you very much for joining us here at this episode of Inside My Canoe Head. Our website will be up and running very shortly at insidemycanoehead.ca. If you go to each episode, there is a support the show button there. You can pop on there and buy me a coffee. I am fueled by great black simple coffee. No additives required. If you do one thing to support this show, I would ask that you share it. We grow our audience and our message about preparedness and understanding the emergency management space in which we live. We simply do that by growing and sharing to somebody. So if you like the podcast, if you think there's some information on here that others would find informative, helpful, or otherwise, send them the link. Get them on board. There's no fee for this podcast. I make no money. There is no advertising, and the show episodes are not sponsored by anybody. This is simply our community service to bring the message of preparedness, the non-apocalyptic, evidence-based preparedness education for rational people, which is the mission and vision, or which is the vision for the parent company Preparedness Labs Incorporated. We put out 2, ideally when we get back up and running in May, we'll be putting out 2 Substack articles a week. We put out 2 podcasts a week, and we'll be back up and running on our 2 videos per week. So basically we have a message and we put it out twice a week in all 3 formats, whether that be audio, visual, or written, depending on how you wish to consume the content. It's free of charge. It's our way of providing free education. Yep, we have paid products, unapologetically so. They're at our website at preparednesslabs.ca. We're going to fix that up shortly, again, part of our modernization. But in the end, everything we offer here is free. What a paid product does for you is it provides it in a summative format and not across 340 plus episodes. So thank you very much for joining us again. Have yourself a great week as we approach the Holy Easter weekend. Take care, and whether you're religious or not, when you get the downtime, when you get some time off, pause, spend it with family, because in the end, that's who matters, right? Spend it with the people you care about. Spend it with the people you love. Enjoy their presence. Be there, because life is all too fleeting. And if one thing a medical emergency in life has taught me over the last couple of months is life can be short. So take your time, enjoy it. All right, take care and stay safe.